The objective of this particular session is to explain the theory of Vontunen model, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the theory, what is the relevance of Vontunen model to present condition, and what is the relevance of Vontunen model to Indian conditions. Geographers are concerned with understanding why things happen in geographical spaces. J. H. Vontunen, in the era of 1783 to 1850, was a farmer on the North German plains, and he developed the foundation of rural land use theory. Because he was a keen observer of the landscape around him, he noticed that similar plot of land in different locations were often used for very different purposes. He concluded that these differences in land use between plots with similar physical characteristics might be the result of differences in location relative to the market. Thus, he went about trying to determine the role that distance from market plays in creating rural land use pattern. He was interested in finding laws that govern the interaction between agriculture prices, distance, and land use as farmers sought to make the greatest profit possible. The Vontunen model is focused on how agriculture is distributed around a city in a concentric circle. The dot represents a city, and the first ring, white ring, which is dedicated to market, gardening, and fresh milk production. That is because of milk products and garden crops such as milk that spoil quickly. Remember that at the time of Vontunen developed this model, there was no refrigeration. So it was necessary to get perishable produce to the market immediately. Because of this, producers of perishable crops were willing to outbid producers of less perishable crops to gain access to the land use closest to the market. This means that land close to the community created a higher level of economic rent. Vontunen model of agriculture distribution around city in concentric circle. The second ring, Vontunen believed, would be dedicated to the production and harvest of forest products. This was because in the early 19th century, people used wood for building, cooking, and heating. Wood is bulky and heavy and therefore difficult to transport. Still, it is not nearly as perishable as milk or fresh vegetables. For those reasons, Vontunen reasoned that wood producers would bid more for the second ring of land around the market centers than all other producers of wood and fibers except for those engaged in production of milk and fresh vegetables. The third ring, Vontunen believed, would be dedicated to crop rotation system. In his time, rye was the most important cash grain crop. Inside the third ring, however, Vontunen believed there would be differences in the intensity of cultivation. Because of the cost of gaining access to land rent drops with distance from the city, those farming at other edge of the ring would find that lower rents would offset increased transportation costs. Moreover, because those farming the outer edges would pay less rent, the level of input they could invest prior to reaching the point of decreasing marginal return, in other words, we can say marginal returns, refer to change in production relative to change in input. Now comes the fourth ring. The fourth ring would be dedicated to livestock ranching. Vontunen reasoned that unlike perishable or bulky items, animals could be walked to the market. Additionally, products such as wool, hide, horn, and so on could be transported easily without concern about spoilage. In this model, wilderness bounded the outer margin of Vontinen's isolated estate. These lands, he argued, would eventually develop rent value as the population of the state increased. Thus, in this fundamental theory, the only variable was the distance from the market. Vontinen was a farmer, and as such, he understood that his model did not exist in the whole of the real world. He developed it as an analytical tool that could be manipulated to explain the rural land patterns in a world of multiple variables. To do this, Vontinen relaxed his original assumptions at a time to understand the role of each variable. One of the more stringent assumptions in the Vontinen model was his assumption that all parts of the state would have equal access to all other parts of the nation, with distance being the only variable allowed. Railways existed, and navigable water routes significantly reduced the friction of distance between the places they served. Therefore, he introduced a navigable waterways into his model and found that because produce would be hauled to docks on the stream for transport, each zone of production would elongate along the stream. Vontinen also considered what would happen if he relaxed his assumption that production costs were equal in all ways, except for the cost associated with distance from the market. Eventually, as he worked with his model, he began to consider the effects of differences in climates, topography, soil, and labor. Each of these could serve to benefit or restrict production in a given place. For example, lower wages might offset the advantages realized by being near a market. The difference in the soil might also offset the advances of being close to the market. Thus, a farmer located some distance from the market with access to well-drained, well-watered land, with excellent soil and low-cost labor nearby might be willing to pay higher rent for the property in question, even if it were a bit further from the market than another piece of land that did not have such amenities. Vontinen's concentric circles were the result of the limits he imposed on his model in order to remove all influences except for distance. Once real-world influences are allowed to invade the model, the concentric land use pattern does not remain in place. Modern technologies such as advances in transportation system increasingly complicates the basic concentric circles model. Recent changes like the demand for agriculture products also influence land use pattern. Change in demand for farm products often have dramatic impacts on land uses. For example, when fuel production companies demanded dramatically increased quantities of corn to produce ethanol, and the price of corn rose accordingly. Farmers responded by shifting from other food crops to ethanol producing corn. As a result, land use suited for corn production was now sold at premier prices. Currently, there is little extra farmland available upon which an expansion might take place. Therefore, changes in demand typically result in farmers shifting to crops that will bring the highest return. The Mid-Willamette Valley of Oregon provides another example of how change in demand affect agricultural land uses. For years, this valley was the site of many medium-sized grain farms. The primary grain crop included wheat, barley, oats, Austrian peas, and clovers. Also, farmers in the region produced low crops, orchard crops, hay, and grass seeds. During the 1970s, in response to increasing demand, the price of grass seed increased dramatically. As a result, Willamette Valley farmers quickly changed their focus from production of grain to grass seeds. Soon after, several grain processing facilities closed and grass seeds cleaning, storage, and market facilities opened. There were another unexpected impact as well. For example, this valley grain farmers once provided excellent habitat for Chinese peasants. These peasants eat grain, but they do not eat grass seed. When the grain fields disappeared, so too did the peasants. Like peasants, people do not eat grass seed. Eventually, however, when the demand for food is satisfied, subsequent increases in income will no longer bring corresponding increase in the demand for food. This is the result of elasticity of demand relative to changes in income. The measure of elasticity of demand is calculated by noting the amount of increase in demand for an item that a unit of increase in income generates. I hope you understood this. For example, luxury products such as expensive wine have a high elasticity of demand, whereas more common items such as rice have low elasticity of demand. Once a family has all the rice they can typically eat, it will not purchase more as a result of more income. More income, however, would likely bring as an increase in the consumption of prime cuts of beef or other such luxury foods. New technology in transportation, agriculture production, and the processing of food and fiber often have substantial impacts on the use of rural land. Technological changes mainly influence transportation. For instance, the construction of the rail lines that connected the Midwestern United States with the market centers of the Eastern made it possible for farmers in Iowa and other prairie states to improve their profit by feeding the corn they grew to hogs, which they then shipped to the markets in the East. Thus, by feeding the corn to the hogs and then shipping the hogs, the farmers could earn greater profit because the shipping cost of the product were lower. In a sense, the farmers were selling corn on the hoof. Without easy access to railheads, this profitable agricultural scheme would not have been possible. Over the years, improvements in technologies have tended to drive down the relative costs associated with shipping farm produce. Furthermore, inventions such as refrigerated rail cars and trucks have eliminated some of the land use constraints that once limited the locational choice of farmers who produced perishable goods. Less expensive haulage costs, decreased transit times, and better handling and processing methods have all served to make transportation system more efficient and hence less expensive. In theory, this should serve to reduce the importance of distance relative to other non-distance factors. Consider how far from the market a producer of fresh vegetable could locate in early 19th century. The lack of all-weather roads and reliance on the transportation conveyances of the time, I am talking in terms of human and animal power, dictated a production location within a few miles of the market. The creation of all-weather roads that could be traversed by a horse and a wagon, however, changed the situation. Without the roads, fresh vegetable growers would have been forced to pay high prices for land very near the market. With the roads, they were able to use less expensive lands and still get their crops to market before spoilage made it impossible to sell them. If the creation of an all-weather road made such a difference in land uses, imagine the impact of the refrigerated aircraft now used to deliver loads of fresh flowers. Currently, many of the fresh flowers sold in US supermarkets come to the United States from Netherlands via giant jet transport aircrafts. This technology has significantly altered the importance of distance relative to the production of fresh flowers. Though basic forces still persist, circumstances when compared with those in Europe of the last century, certain changes can be identified. For instance, new and quicker model of transportation, first one. Second is transportation cost do not always vary similarly in all directions. Third is refrigeration has prolonged the life of perishable commodities like milk and vegetables. Fourth is firewood is no more the major fuel. This Vonthanen model only provides a method or approach which may be applied generally without claiming universality. The model is limited by the few assumptions. For an instance, first is all operations have complete knowledge about yield and prices. The second is the operators always make rational decisions about land use and cropping pattern. In the Great Plains of India, highly fertile lands surrounding the village settlements are devoted to perishable fertilizers, intensive crops, for example, vegetable, potatoes, oats, crops like rice, wheat, barley, pulses, sugarcane, etc. are cultivated subject to the texture, drainage and other qualities of soil. In the outer ring, fodder crops and inferior cereals are grown. After the initiation of tube well irrigation in North Indian plains, this pattern has been modified as farmers with less intensive inputs can produce crops in distant fields. The land consolidation has also modified the crops intensity rings. One study in village of Tauda in Haridwar, Uttar Pradesh found that crop intensity is decreasing with increasing distance from the settlement. The application of high yield variety seeds in India has disturbed the application of Vonthanen model. Developed modes of transport have made it possible to carry perishable goods to greater distances. So, this model we can say that is no longer operative in its original form, but still, as in the beginning I mentioned, that we always follow a model or method or one approach that can be applicable in general. So, when this Vonthanen model started or when it was initiated or when it was propounded, the circumstances of the 19th century was different from the current scenario, but no doubt it has provided a basic applicability of agriculture pattern in rural areas. In conclusion, I can say that Vonthanen leads to the following conclusion. The first is the number of profitable options decreases with distance from the city market. The second is the nature of activity in outer distances depends on declining profit based on transportation. And the third is the nature of activity in inner distances depends on the desire for more lucrative alternatives. The agriculture land use thus follows a concentric pattern as shows practical adoption to modifications such as introduction of a navigable river and another smaller city mart.